That really is what we are talking about in worship and all that we're doing this morning. We are looking at the connection that God wants us to have with Him, the connection that we should have with the Father. And so that's what we've been singing about. That's what we're talking about in this series that we're in right now as well. If you've been with us the last few weeks, you know that we've been looking at how God and money and that relationship all fits together. And yeah, it's a little bit awkward. I mean, we just admitted that up front. We just said this is one of those things where it's like, oh, great, did I really have to show up today? But it's an important subject. It really is an important thing that we need to talk about. As we just dive into this, I'm going to ask you to participate with me for just a minute. I'm not going to make you stand up or come up here and embarrass yourself in any way. But since we're talking about money, just kind of go with me for a second. How many of you would say, as it relates to money, that you are a saver? That you like to take your money and you like to store it away in a bank account? Like 3 of them? Okay, there are a few more. All right, there you go. Thank you for participating. How many of you would say, I am a spender and not a saver? All right, so it's kind of interesting. In the last service, we had mostly savers. This service, we have mostly spenders. I don't know what that says about us. Maybe those who like to sleep in a little later like to spend a little extra as well, right? Yeah, there you go. Okay, so imagine this with me. Maybe this won't even be a stretch for you to imagine this, but imagine that you married somebody who is the opposite of you. So you're a spender and you married a saver, or you're a saver and you married a spender. Imagine that you join your life with somebody who is opposite of you in that way, but you never have a conversation about money. How do you think things are going to go in your relationship? Probably not really well. You know, chances are one or the other of you are going to end up, on Dateline because you died, right? Because you're going in two opposite directions, right? You have joined your life together, but you are going completely different directions in terms of money. As we're talking about God and money, as we're saying we owe it to you to have the money conversation, to look at how God views money and to say this is the heart of God on money, because really this is a series for believers, and we're saying if you are in a relationship with God, if you have joined your life to God, but you never have the money conversation, you are exactly like that couple we just described, where one is going one direction and another is going the other direction, and it is absolutely going to mess up the way the relationship goes. And so this morning, as we continue talking about this, I'm going to present something to you that maybe is a little the way you have thought of money and God's view of money in the past. But what I think you're going to see in the stories that we look at this morning is that God is going to show us that money is a rite of passage. And you may say, what in the world are you talking about? Right? So we're going to unfold this a little bit this morning, but when I say rite of passage, you understand what I'm talking about, right? It's kind of this movement from childhood to maturity or to adulthood. And in some cultures, they do this really well. If you've paid attention to the Jewish culture, you know that in Jewish culture, they have something that they do for boys that turn 13 or girls that turn 13 called a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah. And this is the rite of passage from childhood to adulthood, right? By the way, anybody who wasn't in a previous service know what those words mean? Do you know what bar mitzvah means? I'm sure you do. You just don't want to say it, right? It's intimidating in front of the whole crowd. So here's the bar mitzvah. Bar means son of. Mitzvah means the commandments. Bat mitzvah, which is for girls, means daughter, bat, daughter of the commandments. And the whole idea there is this rite of passage. It's saying, to this point in time, you've been a child, you've been under your parents' care, your parents were responsible for your actions. But at this point in time, it is saying you are a son of the commandments of God, or you're a daughter of the commandments of God. At this point in time, you are responsible for carrying out the things that you have learned about the commandments of God. And so it's this rite of passage. Maybe you didn't do that in your family if you didn't grow up Jewish, which I didn't, but maybe you had other things that were your kind of rite of passage deal. So if you have a teenage son, maybe you take him out and you go on that first big hunt, where he gets the elk for the first time and he provides for the family for the first time. And in that moment, it's kind of, oh, I'm a man, right? I have provided for my family. And that's the rite of passage, moving from childhood to maturity or to adulthood. If you have daughters, maybe it was that you had a sweet 16 party for her. And even the name that we give that implies what's going on. Sweet 16, right? We all know they weren't sweet all the way before that, but the idea is they were innocent to 16, and at 16 they're becoming adults, they're becoming responsible. They have gone through this rite of passage. I really believe that God is saying to us in this passage we're going to look at today that money is a rite of passage in your life. It's almost like the bar mitzvah, it's almost like the hunting trip, it's almost like the sweet 16. It's this thing that if you understand it from the view of God and understand it correctly, it takes you from immaturity or childhood in faith to maturity in faith. So let's look at this together. What we're going to look at is we're going to look at a story that Jesus tells. It's not really a story, it's a teaching. But it is found in Matthew chapter 6, and we're going to just kind of walk through this. But just to remind you of where we are here, if you were with us a month ago, you may have read through the book of Matthew with us. And you may remember that Matthew chapters 5 through 7 are this long speech by Jesus, this long discourse that he gives. And it's known as the Sermon on the Mount. You may have heard of that before, right? Well, the Sermon on the Mount, the whole point of this is that Jesus has gotten his disciples together, and there are others that have come around and have started listening. And Jesus is telling them, if you are truly going to have a relationship with God, if you are walking with God, if you have joined your life to him, your life is going to look different in certain ways than the rest of the world. And so if you just think through the Sermon on the Mount, you may remember there's a point where Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, and you are the light of the world. He's saying to those people, he's saying, if you have joined your life to God, you're going to be the flavor of the world. You're going to bring light into darkness. It's going to be this little bit different thing that's happening in you that the rest of the world sees and notices, right? He talked at another point in the Sermon on the Mount about prayer. And says, if you are connecting to God, if you're growing in God, then prayer is going to be a huge part of the way that you do life. You don't just do life by logic. You go to God and you listen to him. You connect with him. You let him help lead you and direct you. And then he talks about loving neighbors and enemies. And maybe those two are one and the same. Maybe it's loving your enemy neighbor. I don't know. But he says this is the way that you are going to do life. If you're doing it with God, if you're doing it God's way, it's not going to look like you used to do life. You're going to love people in a new way. It's in the midst of that context where he's talking about how to connect to God, how to relate to God, that he starts this awkward conversation about money and says, if you are walking with God, you're going to look at and handle your stuff a little bit differently than you used to, a little bit differently than the rest of the world does. And so, like I said, it's in chapter 6 where he does this. We're just going to read the first verse of this section. It's kind of a long section. We're not going to read through the whole thing, but I want you to see this first verse because this is a huge thing. If you've been in church for most of your life, you've heard this a number of times. But I want you to hear it, not just let it go in one ear and out the other. Listen to the words that Jesus says when he starts this conversation on money. He says this, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth. For all of you who just said you were savers, this is like, oh, great. Now what do I do, right? I'm like on the opposite side of God. I thought God was on my side. I thought God was conservative, that he was a saver, and all of that. And Jesus comes directly out and says, here's the thing about money. God doesn't care about you accumulating money here on earth. And he goes on and explains that. He says, the reason is, as you accumulate things here on earth, none of it's safe. At any point in time, it could be taken from you. At any point in time, you could lose it in the stock market or whatever you have it invested in. The way Jesus literally says it is he says that moth can eat it and rust can destroy it and the thief can steal it, right? So he says, don't worry about accumulating earthly stuff. In fact, he goes on and says, the thing is, if you're saving your earthly stuff, if you're accumulating here on earth, you're saving in the worst possible investment that you can save in because it can be gone at any time. So he says, instead, and here's where it comes back to you savers, okay? He says, instead, save in heaven. Put your stuff in eternity where it never is going away, where it never is stolen from you. Invest in the things of God for eternity, not in earthly things for now. So in this section, he just makes it really clear. If you want to know God's heart on money, know that this is what God says. I'm not interested in you accumulating stuff here on earth. Just not. That's where God comes to us. And then Jesus goes on and explains that further. This is the part I want us to read. So we'll jump down to verse 25 and just read through several verses here. But Jesus says this, starting in verse 25. He says, therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, about what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more important than food, and the body more important than clothes? And so he starts out and he just says, because God is not interested in earthly accumulation, you shouldn't be worried. In other words, that word therefore, I don't know if you've heard this, but I heard a long time ago, a really corny little saying. But they say if you see therefore in the Bible, you need to see what it's there for. Right? And like I said, really corny, but what it's saying is pay attention to the context. What came before this that makes this important, right? And so, like we said, the thing that comes directly before this is God saying, I'm not interested in you accumulating stuff on earth. You don't need to worry about that. And Jesus says, because God is not interested in your earthly accumulation, he says, don't worry about what you're going to eat. Don't worry about what you're going to drink. Don't worry about what you're going to wear. You trust that God is going to provide for your needs. Most of the world looks at this and says, I have to accumulate so I can meet my needs. And God says, no, you really don't. You just keep working with me and I will provide for you. I will take care of your needs. And as he starts to unfold this, he gives a couple of illustrations. So he gives us the illustration about eating and wearing things. He gives us the illustration about food. That's where he starts to help us understand this. And then he gives us an illustration about the clothes that we wear. So let's just walk through these illustrations with him to see where he's going to go with this. Verse 26, he says this, look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? And then he says, who of you by worrying can add a single hour to his life? I don't know if you've ever thought of it in these terms, but really, this is almost like comical, what Jesus is saying here. He's looking at us and he's saying, do you see how God takes care of the rest of creation, all of creation around you? And you're like the highlight of creation. Do you think God's going to just ignore you? And he gives this example where he says, look at the birds of the air. Let me just ask you a question. As you think about birds and as you think about food, have you ever seen a morbidly obese bird? If you have, I want to see it. I mean, I've not seen one. I'm guessing maybe there are some out there, but I just don't run into incredibly fat birds all that often, where you see them like trying to get off the ground, but they just don't have enough strength in the wings and their bellies, sliding across the concrete. I don't know if you've ever seen that, right? Chances are you have not. Do you know why you haven't seen that? Because birds don't think like we do. Chances are there's not a bird around that is sitting here today thinking, oh man, I'm pretty worried that there aren't going to be any more worms in my little patch of the world here, and so I better get as many as I can. I better eat as much as I can right now and take all this in, because what happens if there are no more worms out there tomorrow, They don't think that way, right? They just eat what they need, go about life, and when they need to eat again, they know that their Father, their Creator, is going to provide for them. And it may not be a worm every time. It may be that they have to eat birdseed or grain or whatever awful thing they would have to eat, right? But they're not worried about it. They're not sitting there fretting over where is the next worm going to come from. They just trust. And Jesus kind of looks at us and says, if the rest of creation can relate to God in this way, why can't you relate to God in this way, where you just trust that as you keep doing life, He's going to meet your needs? Now, the other side of the coin is that you also don't see birds sitting around saying, well, I'm not going out looking for worms because God is going to provide. And so I'm just going to stay right here, and God's going to bring me the food that I need, and these worms are just going to come across. No, they have to go out, they have to work, they have to use the abilities that God has given them, right? But they are provided for. In the same way, I think God is saying to us, yeah, you're going to have to work, you're going to have to go out and use your abilities that I've given you. But just know that I am your provider. I am taking care of you. And so He's starting to present us with this idea that really what God is showing us here is that money is this rite of passage. It's moving us from a place of fear. It's moving us from a place of childishness and infancy to adulthood, to maturity, to a place of faith. It's taking us on this journey from being infants in our faith to being mature in our faith. And I think God looks at money and says, that's my goal. My goal is to use your stuff to bring you closer to me. My goal is to use your money to help you connect with me on a deeper level. And so I think if we were to put all of this into one statement, what we would say is that money is God's tool to move us from fear to faith, from infancy to maturity. And Jesus just keeps giving us these examples to show us that, man, even creation understands this. Even the birds of the air understand this. And He goes on and He gives us another illustration. So I told you He was going to talk about food. He's going to talk about clothing. In verse 28, He says, and why do you worry about clothes? And by the way, you may be the kind of person that says, well, good news, I don't worry about clothes. You know, I think I run into that in Colorado more than anywhere else, which I love, to tell you the truth. But maybe you're the person who, you've been wearing the same socks since you were in college 37 years ago, and they got holes in them and everything else, and that's totally good with you. Maybe you don't worry about clothes, but what Jesus is literally saying here is He's saying, why are you worried about your image? Maybe your clothing is not your thing, but what about your car? What about your truck? What about your tractor? What about your home or the things in your home? Do you ever invite people over to your house and you're all worried about, I wonder what they're going to think about the way I've decorated. I wonder what they're going to think about my stuff, right? God says, why are you worried about that? Of all things you could worry about, why are you worried about your image here? And Jesus goes on and says, see how the lilies of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all of his splendor was dressed like one of these. That's how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire. Will He not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? I used to read that and think, this is a really weird comparison, right? It's like comparing this man Solomon to flowers, and I'm not sure how this connects or how it relates. But really what He's saying is kind of explained in verse 30, where He's saying, look at the grass of the field. He says, it's here today and tomorrow it's thrown into the fire. If you look at the way that they use grass and utilize grass in the Middle East, not only in the first century, all the way up to today, if you look at the way they utilize grass, a lot of times the thing that the grass is used for is for fire. It's fuel for a fire. They put it in the oven and they burn it so that they can heat other things up. And Jesus is saying, if God cares enough to dress the grass up by putting flowers in the middle of it, if God cares enough about the grass to give it fashion by putting lilies or orchids or birds of paradise or whatever, flower you want to imagine in your head. God cares enough about the grass that's here today and thrown in the fire tomorrow. If he cares enough about that to give it fashion, don't you think he's going to take care of you? And again, it's this presentation. Don't you understand that the fear that comes with money, the fear that we associate with accumulation, says that's about infancy in your faith. God wants to take money and use it as this tool that takes you to the next place where you mature in your faith. He goes on in verse 31 and says, so do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need it. Jesus is not throwing out, bad names there, calling people pagans. It literally means people that don't know God. So he's saying people who are completely separated from God, the things that they think about are, how do I accumulate enough to make sure I'm okay? He says, but if you have a relationship with God, it should be different. It should be one of these things where you say, I don't have to invest all of my time and energy in accumulation because I have a Father who takes care of me. It's this transition from childhood to maturity in the way that we relate to God. Going on, the last verse here, Jesus gets to a point where he says, for some of you, you're at a place where you just need to worry about something. Right? You know these people. They need to have some anxiety in their life in order to feel okay about the world. They need to have something to worry about in order to feel comfortable, right? And Jesus says, if you're that person, if you're the one who has to worry about something, here's what you worry about. He says, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. If you just need to worry about stuff, if you just need to worry about money, he says, this is what you should worry about. Am I using the money that's been entrusted to me in order to seek the things of God? Am I using the resources that have been placed in my care to advance the kingdom of God? That's what you worry about. That's what you should seek. So all of that, if we pull all that together, again, what I think Jesus is saying is he's saying money is God's tool to move us from fear to faith. Let me ask you a couple of questions that are just practical questions in this. Here's question number one. As you think about money, do you think God is saying in this context that money is a bad thing? I don't think he is. I don't see in this context where he's saying money is evil. Stay away from money. Don't get close to that kind of stuff. He actually uses that for our good, right? He uses it to provide for our needs, but he also uses it to help us grow in our relationship with him. So I don't think he's saying that money is bad. It's the way that we interact with money. In fact, I would say if you just have in your mind that you want to earn buckets of money, if you want to earn as much money as you can, I think God says, go ahead, work for money, earn as much money as you can. The place that it becomes a problem is if you say, I'm going to earn buckets and buckets of money so that I can have what I need, so that I can accumulate for me or for my family later on. That's where it becomes a problem. I think God says if you want to earn buckets and buckets of money so that you can meet your needs and so that you can use the rest to seek the kingdom of God, wow, that's a great thing. That's an incredible thing. There's nothing wrong with that. He says if you want to earn buckets and buckets of money so that you can change your family tree and so that you can leave this huge inheritance to your kids. Well, again, that's the accumulation for me, right? That's the accumulation for us. He's saying you're actually stifling your child's relationship with me if you hand buckets of money over to them, because they need to learn that I'm their provider as well. But if you use your resources for seeking the kingdom, that's an entirely different thing. So here's kind of the big question that I want us to wrestle with this week. This is the thing that I want you to start to roll around in your mind. When is the last time you made a money decision that caused you to go deeper in faith? That's what matters to God. When is the last time you made a financial decision that caused you to grow closer to the Father? That's what matters. That's what God cares about. And so I want to show you a video in just a second that is of a woman named Renee. And Renee's story may not resemble your story exactly, but the principles in this video, I think, will resemble what God is talking to us about today. This is a practical way to start thinking about what we are talking about. How do we live this out? How do we start making financial decisions, money decisions, where it's about, is this driving me deeper in faith rather than is this providing for my accumulation? So watch this video with me and we'll discuss it in a second.
I used to have this idea that I would be free when I was, well, I don't know. I think there was a time when I thought freedom and control had a lot to do with each other. Somewhere probably around high school, I made a decision that I wanted to go into medicine. I knew I wanted to be a physician. It was a while before I settled on the specialty of obstetrics and gynecology. I drive to work each day really feeling blessed that I have the career I have, that God has given me a job that's a ministry. I feel like I've got the best job in the world. That's our little spot. Morning. All of pregnancy is a lesson in patience and a lesson in flexibility. It just teaches me as I watch women experience that, how important it is to live in the moment. I get to walk with women and families through really, really joyful times and through some really challenging times. I get to experience life from the beginning to the moment baby takes its first breath. I think the problem for a long while was that my vision of what was freedom was not in line with what God says is freedom. I had a real turning point at 37. It's about 3 years ago. I'd been in Austin for 7 years, been in practice as an OB-GYN for 7 years. I had accomplished everything I set out to accomplish. I had a successful career, I was out of debt, and I just hit a point where I realized that I had all this, and I was not in the content place I imagined that I'd be. It was a really uncomfortable place to be in, to realize that you'd accomplished your goals, and now what? Now what's next? And then to feel a sense of just a hole, like an emptiness inside, as if something was missing, and yet not know what that is. As God realigned my values with His values and showed me places where I thought I was free, but I wasn't yet free, that changed everything. Because suddenly there were some areas where I had to take some steps of surrender, imagining that those were going to lead to more restriction and less freedom, only to find the opposite was true. That was in money, that was in relationship, but I didn't really understand yet what true freedom was going to look like. So often when I get home from work, I can't wait to get my shoes on and get out on the trail. When I'm running, I hear really radical things from God, and that's where I go to meet Him. I feel like that's the time when He puts thoughts in my head that are really beyond myself. But that's when I get ideas. I think when I made a decision that it was time to just go all out and live for Christ, that it was time to really discover what it meant to be an offering to Christ, to live my life fully surrendered. It started to get crazy, the things that I would hear. The biggest and most radical thing I've ever heard was, your relationship and your faith are not compatible, and it's time to do something about that. That was my big breakthrough, was '07. God moved me out of a relationship, convinced me and convicted me that was not honoring to Him, and it was time to lay that down. The second most frightening thing I've ever heard God say had to do with my finances. You can't go and look at another culture and not do this compare and contrast of like, this is what they have, this is how they live, this is what I have, and this is how I live. There are times when I would just sit in that and it would just break me. And I just realized that it's only by God's grace that I have anything more than they have. It's not because I'm entitled to it or I deserve it. And even if I say, well, yeah, but I earned it or I worked for it, then I would hear in the other ear, but I gave you the ability. I gave you the opportunity. I gave you the talent. I gave you the funding. I gave you the resource. I gave you the education. It's like, what do you have that I haven't given you? I was on a run and I just in a conversation with him, just thinking about how might I change in response to what I had just seen, what I had just experienced. I'm just running and I hear God say, I want you to work like a doctor and I want you to live like a nurse. So I started thinking, well, sure, I could live on half my salary. And then I started thinking, well, I could live on a quarter of my salary. And I just kind of froze in that and started thinking, well, about a quarter of my salary is probably about what the average nurse is making. I basically just took my salary and I just sectioned it off. And I said, well, this is what a nurse would make. And then the remaining 3/4 is his. And I felt like God said, that's right, that's what you share. I'm not gonna lie, it took some time getting used to living on a budget again. I hadn't really had to stop and think about how I was spending my money for a while. I don't feel like God is only asking me to spend and live within my means, but I think He's also talking to me about how I save. I mean, I've been saving for retirement pretty generously and investing a lot of money. My goals were to retire at 50 and to retire with a certain amount of money, to live at a certain lifestyle. You know, I lost 6 figures in an investment, and at that point, I felt like, you know, I was telling you that's when I had a lot of peace. And I had a lot of peace because I felt like God was saying, why are you saving so much money? I felt like God wanted me to save to a lesser degree as well, and to be much more generous with my money by sharing it now. When I have a choice about whether to save or whether to share, and I get to bless somebody, often behind the scenes, and see the way that it's impacted their life, and the reality is, it feels right. It's very satisfying. Very full life and a very satisfying life. And I feel like that hole that I had 3 or 4 years ago, that I wondered, what is it and how do I get it filled, has been filled to overflowing. And I feel like it fills me up and then it pours out to others around me in a way that I hope I bring a lot of joy to people's lives. And that joy I wouldn't have to give if He hadn't first given it to me. So
for some of you, the thing that you're going to remember about that video is you're going to remember that child being born, right? And for some of you women, you're thinking, that is the most beautiful thing I've seen all day. And some of you men just threw up a little bit in your mouth. But there is a bigger point here. What she's saying is maybe you won't ever have the income of a medical doctor. I'm guessing that none of us will. So maybe you don't have that kind of income. But what if God is giving you more than you need, not so that you can increase your standard of living? What if He's giving you more than you need so that you can increase your standard of giving? So that you can use that to seek His kingdom. I just want to leave you with the question this morning that we asked a minute ago, the question that I think we need to wrestle with this week. In terms of, when is the last time you made a money decision that truly moved you deeper in your faith? That's the question that I think God wants us to answer. He doesn't care about the accumulation. He doesn't care if it's a huge sacrificial gift. What He cares about is this moving you to Him? Is this a step that is causing you to stop being dependent on stuff and start being dependent on Him? Is this a rite of passage that is taking you from infancy in your faith to maturity in your faith? That's what God cares about.